Fernando, thanks a lot for the kind introduction and above all for the kind opportunity to present here in this webinar on recent trends in the debate on corporate renewable sourcing. Also thanks to everyone out there for tuning in to this webinar. The presentation is structured as follows. I'll first obviously give a brief introduction into the topic, and we'll do a quick recap of the basic renewable sourcing options, although I assume that most participants will be familiar with the basic options available. And we'll then dive into the recent market developments that we're seeing, which are really market fundamentals that improve the business case for corporate renewable sourcing fundamentally. But we'll also highlight then a few recent and upcoming regulatory developments on EU level that will impact, as Fernando has said before, the business case and the availability of different corporate renewable sourcing options. And then I will highlight a few other pressing issues that are required to being addressed for the further market uptake, and will then revert to a few conclusions and outlook. So to directly dive into it, just a brief presentation of Ecofys, a Navigant company. We're a global consulting company which was founded in 1984 with a mission to enable sustainable energy to everyone. And the next one is probably important. Since 2016, we have been part of the Navigant's global energy practice. We have 5 offices in Europe, in Utrecht, Cologne, Berlin, Brussels, and London. And as part of Navigant, our experts are based in more than 20 offices in the US, Canada, Hong Kong, and the Middle East. And in total, together with Navigant, we have 600 experts skilled in energy, climate, environment, economy, etc. And I think one of our core strengths is really that we are able to connect the dots really between the triangle between governments, energy players, and energy-intensive end users, which is important in this context because you need to understand the viewpoints of the different participating parties in corporate renewable sourcing. Just giving a very brief recap of a recent presentation that a colleague of mine, Benjamin Munzel, gave on the basic options for renewable sourcing. On the one hand, you'll be aware of this. Corporates have the option to do self-generation that can be on-site or near-site. And the self-generation, for instance, PV or wind plant, can either be disconnected from the public grid in option A here, and be fully consumed by the consumer, its output, or it can be actually connected to the grid and excess production can be fed into the grid, and then there's just a partial self-consumption share. That's option number 1. Option number 2 would be then the famously discussed power purchase agreements. Again, here you have 2 basic sub-options, which is a PPA with real-time matching of generation and consumption, and a PPA with a balanced consumption over time, whereby a third party, for instance an energy trader, plays a much more prominent role than in the first option. And then of course you have all sorts of products based on guarantees of origin. Basically, guarantees of origin play a role in the power purchase agreements as well to statistically prove that an off-taker has consumed the produced electricity, but also there's GOs related to bundled green power products that you just sort of get at an energy retailer basically, or from a utility. And then there's even the option of the redemption of unbundled GOs. So basically you would acquire GOs and cancel them basically, and thereby statistically make the statement that you have increased your renewable share in your energy consumption. So these are the basic options. And these basic options that I assume you'll be aware of differ in terms of the level of ownership and the location proximity between the production and the consumption sites. And so on the upper right you see the self-generation option. Here it is very usual that these self-generation installations are self-owned also by the consumer, but there's also leasing contractual arrangements possible and very usual here. Self-generation obviously is very close to the consumption center as it's on-site mostly, and going to the next option that I've presented before, the power purchase agreements. Those are often or most of the time third-party owned and contracted. That is the whole purpose of the PPA. And in terms of their location, they show a very wide range of options, because a PPA can span across different price zones or countries even, or can also happen on-site, basically on the same site of production and consumption. And then the third basic option that we're looking at is the guarantees of origin-based options that are usually third-party owned and are usually definitely off-site, and also very often span across countries. For instance, if GOs from Sweden are cancelled for electricity consumption in Germany. Now we present here three very basic options of renewable sourcing. For all of those who attended, for instance, the Renewable Sourcing Conference in Brussels a few weeks ago, there was a lot of discussion about that this topic is quite complex and there's so many different corporate renewable sourcing options. Up to 15 of them have been counted in that conference. But we think that really a lot of these different options ultimately come down to different variations of these three basic options. So that's basically what it is we think that you have as a choice, which really simplifies the approach to corporate renewable sourcing. And then in the end, of course, the final implementation of any corporate renewables solution depends on the specific context, the regulation, the market, and the preferences of the consumer. Another important issue also, this just as part of the recap, are the credibility criteria related to corporate renewable sourcing, because corporate renewable sourcing can have sort of very strong and good effects on the energy transition, but it can also be, if you will, kind of a cheap solution as well, whereby there's no strong link between the production of electricity and the consumption of electricity. And we've elaborated, also based on previous work of other parties, several credibility criteria which we think are important to have in mind as a corporate renewables sourcing company in order to have as robust as possible renewable sourcing solution in place. First of all, this is the claiming instrument that has to be in place, which means basically that you need to have in place a robust guarantees of origin system in which you can statistically, in a robust manner, prove that you've actually consumed the electricity that's been produced elsewhere and that double counting is avoided. The second credibility criterion relates to the eligible technologies for renewable sourcing. That is very obviously related to wind and PV. And in the case that the corporate thinks about sourcing biomass, for instance, for reasons of dispatchability or resource availability, then of course for biomass there's additional sustainability criteria to be considered into this. Then of course someone could think about corporate sourcing also in terms of low carbon sourcing, and that would potentially and theoretically include the sourcing of nuclear power, but from our viewpoint this is something that should definitely be excluded from these options here, well, simply for the reason that we're focusing on corporate renewable sourcing. Another really hotly debated topic is the whole issue of additionality as one credibility criterion. It really relates to the question of how much additional investment is actually triggered by an implemented corporate solution, corporate sourcing solution. For instance, is it really additional renewable power plants that have been installed through the signature of a contract, or is it basically power plants that would have been there anyway and there's no real effect of the corporate renewable sourcing? And this is how you can sort of differentiate some of these solutions in terms of that credibility. Then of course there's the market boundaries. That is an important criterion as well, because installations can either be located very far away from the consumption center. For instance, a PV plant in southern Spain can be theoretically be used for consumption in northern Germany, but then the question always is what kind of physical effect actually does that PV installations, for instance, in southern Spain have on the electricity consumption in northern Germany. So there's a general tendency to say the closer the production is to the consumption side, the better. And then again, there's the facility age. That's hotly debated as well. There's a general tendency to say that the newer an renewables installation is, the better and the more credible the corporate renewables sourcing is. That's a general tendency in the debate. I think there can be good exceptions from this. For instance, if a corporate decides to source renewable energy from a wind power plant that fell out of a subsidy scheme after 15 years, for instance, and that would otherwise not be able to continue its operation because of, for instance, the revenue risk it has at the wholesale market price. So in this case, a corporate PPA could also step in and provide the price security for an already existing installation and really making a tangible contribution to the energy transition in this case. So that's sort of a flexible criterion, I think. And then there's the vintage criterion, excuse me, that kind of basically states that the electricity produced should, in an optimal case, be instantaneously consumed, but there can be time deviations between the production and the consumption of the electricity, and the more time there is between production and consumption, the worse the vintage indicator performs, basically. So this on the credibility criteria. Going to the next slide, you see an overview of how the different credibility criteria perform against the different corporate renewable sourcing options. I won't go into all details here, but you can just as an example see that, for instance, solutions related to unbundled GOs on the very bottom usually perform quite weakly in terms of the additionality, the market boundaries, the facility age, and the vintage. And that, you know, in contrast to this, solutions related to self-consumptions, related to a disconnected microgrid, usually perform pretty well in terms of the claiming instrument, the additionality, the market boundaries, the facility age, and the vintage. And you can see also the relation between the level of credibility and the price of the different options for corporate renewable sourcing that are presented. And in the top right, again, you can see self-generation that is usually or can be quite costly compared to other options, but has a very high level of credibility in terms of making a real contribution to the energy transition and in terms of having a match between the production, the actual physical consumption of electricity. And on the lower left, you can see the unbundled GO solutions that are usually much cheaper, but also have much less effect, much less direct effect on the energy transition, and much less direct relation between the production of electricity and the consumption of electricity. This is just a very quick recap of a webinar that my colleague gave, Benjamin Munzel, on 14th of September. You see 2 links below on YouTube and directly on the Leonardo Energy webpage, where you can actually download his webinar, where you'll see a much more detailed discussion of the different renewables, corporate renewables options, and the different quality criteria, in case you're interested in this. So then going into the next topic, which is recent market developments. We see lately very interesting developments in the field of corporate PPAs, and there's just a few announcements and signatures that have been made public that I'll present here that have just very interesting specific characteristics, which is why I mention them here. In October 2016, for instance, Philips, AkzoNobel, DSM, and Google together signed a so-called club PPA with 2 different cooperatives in the Netherlands, in Zeeland, on the wind park in Kramer, and as the wind park operator said, that aimed at cutting out the middleman, of course. That's one of the aims that's related sometimes to the signature of corporate PPAs. and the claim that these participating players made as well in the press release is that this corporate PPA significantly contributes to delivering on the Dutch renewable energy target of 14% in 2020. Then the next one that is very interesting as well is from May 2017, where Coca-Cola signed a PPA with EDF, and it's a 5 megawatt PV ground-mounted plant, which was only 1.5 miles away from its factory in Wakefield, to cover 15% of the factory's electricity demand. And this PPA again is quite interesting because the first one kind of aimed at including, small players like corporates and cutting out the middleman, whereas this one really includes EDF, which is everything but a small player, and sort of includes, with EDF itself, providing a broad range of energy services, a middleman into this construct. And of course, you see the element of the proximity that is important, and that's been mentioned before as a credibility criterion. The next one that I'll present is from July 2017 that was presented by Google. It's a 10-year PPA with Eneco, with the largest PV plant in Samport in the Netherlands, again, to power a data center in 20-kilometer distance of Google. And that's really interesting as well because, again, you see the proximity as one quality criterion that explicitly shows up here, and then the involvement of Eneco, which in this case means, of course, the middleman that was cut out in one of the former PPAs in which Google was involved is again taken back on board in this PPA. And there's different reasons to do so, basically, because obviously a company can sort of deal with the energy trading and the balancing themselves, but that includes transaction costs, or it can actually hire a third party to deal with the energy balancing and trading, which can facilitate the operation of such a PPA. And then the next one, very recent one and hotly debated one as well, is a 15-year PPA with General Electric to source 100% of 37 megawatts wind farm in County Kerry, including the agreement, and this is interesting, with the Dublin-based energy trading company, again taking on board a third party to deal with the energy trading services. In this context, as far as I know, this has also been a legal requirement to take on a third party that actually deals with the energy trading issues. And this is really different in the different jurisdictions that you're acting in, that the licensing requirements and the other formal requirements to act as an energy trader are very different. So there will always be tailor-made solutions depending on the context that you're operating in. So these are just a few examples of recent developments in corporate PPAs, but there's sort of market fundamentals also that really fundamentally improve the business case for corporate PPAs. We see here a few auction results in Europe for offshore wind. Now, offshore wind hasn't been the typical technology to be involved in a corporate PPA, but it might be so in the future. And you can see that prices have been falling for offshore wind significantly since 2014. And you might wonder why you see auction results for 2024, whereas we're in the year 2017. Of course, these results relate to the price results for the date of commissioning the plant. So that's auctions that have been recently taken place, but they aim for offshore wind farms, the famous one, 0 bids in Germany, that have to be commissioned by 2024 and 2025. So the winning parties in this offshore bid are kind of betting on falling technology costs and increasing wholesale market prices. So this 0 bid, of course, doesn't mean that they don't need revenues. They need the revenues, but they're betting, as I said before, on the falling technology costs and the increasing wholesale market prices. And the final investment decisions for those 0 bids will be ultimately taken in 2021. So basically what the winning parties did there in this renewables auction in Germany is they kind of drew the option to actually take an investment decision in 2021. And in this case, specifically, corporate PPAs can really play a crucial role in providing revenue stability whereas this offshore wind farm would otherwise just merely depend on the revenues from the wholesale market price, which is quite volatile, as you all know, and implies certain revenue risks. We see the same development globally speaking. This is auction results for PV globally in various countries, and the main message here is basically that simply prices are dropping steeply over the last few years, which really improves the business case for corporate renewable sourcing. We looked at this a bit more in detail in this slide for Germany, where we compared 4 different competing forecasts for wind onshore technology and different forecasts for the development of wholesale electricity prices. And what you can see basically is that that in the years between 2018 and 2024, even regardless of what kind of forecast you take, the latest by 2024, you'll see that wholesale market prices according to the forecast will meet with the wind technology costs, which then should be the obvious basic foundation to have a good business case to source these technologies for large corporates. But of course, and this is really important because the slide on the left side of the slide you usually see in many presentations, but obviously the actual specific business case and a specific solution depends on various other factors. For instance, whether the wind farm has access to subsidies for renewables production, which is the case in some countries and not the case in others. Whether there are exemptions from levies, fees and taxes for self-consumption solutions, the balancing costs that can be different in different jurisdictions, of course, and for different technologies. And of course, the business case also depends on how well a match of the production and consumption patterns can be established between the producer and the off-taker, because that has cost implications for the additional energy purchase that is required to meet the actual energy demand. And of course, it depends on the available options for demand response on the consumer side, because that really improves the potential match between production and consumption of energy, and thereby improves the economics of the corporate PPAs. And then, of course, as mentioned before, as soon as you involve third parties, that includes, of course, that's a cost element that influences your business case as well. Looking at this from a slightly different perspective, at sort of how the business case actually works in detail, I'll still provide a simplified overview, but a bit more detailed than in the previous slide. And then usually shown is you start with the standard consumer standard choice, basically, which is a regular retail price of grey electricity. And then on the other hand, you compare this to the costs of the renewables, of course. And here you see the renewables producer perspective that has the cost, the levelized cost of electricity, of course, and then on top of it directly some of the balancing costs, for instance, which in this case are just the balancing costs for deviating from the forecasts, basically. And then actually, of course, as I mentioned before, the access to the subsidies really influences your business case as well, because the subsidies will be deducted from the levelized cost of electricity that otherwise the consumer would have to directly pay for. And then going back to the consumer's perspective is you need to think about what does the consumer need to pay in comparison to the regular retail price of grey electricity, and that's, of course, the levelized cost of electricity and the balancing costs minus the subsidies that we've seen on the left side. But of course, additional costs for balancing measures in terms of matching the actual production with the consumption. And as mentioned before, of course, the contractor premium you have to put on top of this. And you might think, well, how do you end up with a business case and, if you add up all these cost components? But of course, there's many ways of lowering those costs. On the one hand, the subsidies that you've seen on the producer side, but of course, here you see the impact, the potential, the simplified impact as shown here of exemptions for renewable self-consumption, of demand response options that can also lower the cost for the renewables production or improve the usage of the renewables production. And then you also have potential revenues from excess electricity production that can be used to lower costs on the consumer side. So you have to take into account all these different cost elements to actually think about what is the concrete business case and how that can go about. Uh, So we've seen in the previous slides that there's several elements to look at in order to determine the business case, and that there's market fundamentals that heavily point towards the direction of corporate PPAs and other renewable sourcing options to really be a good business case. What you see here is that for the EU, most of the corporate renewables PPAs are located in the UK and Sweden. Other strong markets are Norway and the Netherlands as well. What really calls everyone's attention, of course, is that there's no green corporate PPAs known in very large renewables markets like Germany, France, Spain, and Italy so far. And that really depends on many different factors. It can be regulatory barriers that impede the implementation of corporate PPAs, but it can be also a specific one, as in Germany, where corporate PPAs are generally and legally allowed fully without a problem. However, Germany does not issue guarantees of origin for electricity that is produced and that is publicly subsidized by the German support scheme. They don't do this in order to avoid overcompensation for the renewables production, but it actually poses quite a strong barrier for the implementation of corporate PPAs in the German market. Now, if you look at what are actually the main drivers of corporate PPAs, then you see that corporate PPAs are specifically attractive for the consumers when the actual cost, as seen before, of renewables decrease below the prices for grey electricity or below general market prices. It is specifically attractive for consumers when subsidies are paid for the renewables productions and at the same time the guarantees of origin are issued for this production. And of course, if additional transaction costs or barriers basically are covered by either the producer or other third trading parties. In those cases, the corporate PPAs are specifically attractive for the consumers. And for the producers, they're very attractive, and this is really interesting when actually the support scheme implies strong revenue risks. So in any support scheme for renewables that is based on a fixed premium payment or quota schemes, you have quite strong revenue risks in all these, and in all these support schemes, PPAs are quite usual construct to mitigate revenue risks, but these PPAs are often implemented with local utilities and energy providers, but this is a really strong case for corporate green PPAs as well, because they can as well provide the revenue stabilization for the energy producer and at the same time mitigate their own electricity price risk by fixing a long-term price through a long-term corporate PPA. Then also development that you see throughout the EU and beyond the EU as well is that there's an increased pressure on lowering the subsidy payments. And you've seen this in the auction results slides that the prices are really dropping for renewables and that is really an increased pressure on the subsidy payments through these auctions that you see. And in addition, in many countries, there's a movement or a discussion towards actually phasing out support schemes as the costs for technology really decrease. And whenever the support schemes are either too low, the support payments, or when they are even being phased out, then the renewable energy producer is confronted with the full revenue risk of the wholesale market or of the electricity exchange for that matter. And in all these cases, a corporate PPA can be a key means to reducing these revenue risks by fixing long-term prices. And another case where corporate PPAs can be specifically attractive for producers is what I mentioned before, is when a renewables installation falls out of the support payments after 15 years, for instance, or 20 years of operation, and has operation and maintenance costs, of course, which are quite relevant in some cases. And there's a risk whether the wholesale market prices will be sufficient to cover these operation and maintenance costs. And in this case, also a corporate PPA can play an important role for revenue risk mitigation. So what we see in terms of corporate PPAs is a bit of a paradox, really, because while while on the one hand stable and reliable support schemes, including predictable revenue streams, are really crucial for cost-effective renewables deployment, they immediately reduce the need for corporate PPAs, at least on the producer side, because the producer basically signs a corporate PPA to reduce the revenue risk. Well, under a floating feed-in premium scheme, or even under a feed-in tariff, a fixed one, you don't have that revenue risk. And you see that where the investment environment is quite difficult, then the corporate PPAs can provide the necessary price risk mitigation. So I think it's really important to not use corporate PPAs as an argument to sort of, weaken public support schemes for renewables, but we can just see that corporate PPAs can play a really crucial role in a complementary role in a phase where support schemes are really being put under pressure and prices are really coming down for renewables, and renewables are increasingly exposed to wholesale market prices, which is really important for the market integration, of course. Going to the next chapter, basically, we don't just see sort of market fundamentals that improve the case for corporate PPAs, but also regulatory developments, which here focus very much on the European context. Please excuse that to all the listeners that are not located in the EU, but there are some really important developments in the EU context. So you're all aware that at the end of 2016, the European Commission proposed the Clean Energy for All package, basically, which will define how member states will have to implement large parts of the energy laws, how energy trading will function and happen, and how renewables will be treated in European member states. And what's currently happening in this year is that the European Council and the European Parliament are finding their own positions towards the Clean Energy for All proposal by the European Commission. And in 2018 and potentially towards 2019, we'll see the trilogue procedure on EU level, which will ultimately, very hopefully, lead in the adoption of the final proposals of this clean energy package. And this legislative framework for renewables on European level will then enter into force in 2021 and will have to be immediately implemented by the member states. So this is the legal framework that heavily influences how renewables are treated, and therefore how corporate renewables PPAs can be implemented as well. And there's an explicit provision in the Renewable Energy Directive that has been proposed by the European Commission for the period from 2020 to 2030. And that explicitly states, which is good, that member states shall remove administrative barriers to corporate long-term power purchase agreements to finance renewables and facilitate their uptake. So it's really been a good move by proponents of corporate renewables PPAs to have this put in there. But obviously the question is which barriers exactly are meant here, because the barriers are very different according to the member state. It can be, for instance, related to licensing requirements for off-takers. It can be related to licensing requirements in terms of having the status of an energy trader when you're an off-taker of a PPA, and so on and so forth. And of course, the legal framework is always the stronger for corporate PPAs, the more detailed it is. And sort of just stating that barriers should be removed is a first good move, but the question is whether this is sufficient, and it would be preferable if this provision would be more detailed in the Renewables Directive. And many different stakeholders are sort of discussing on how to go forward with this. But there's other two very key provisions also in the Renewables Directive that will influence the future design and business cases for corporate renewables options, which is the provisions on the guarantees of origin, because as you know, guarantees of origin are required to really statistically prove that you as an off-taker have actually consumed the electricity produced from a specific plant. And of course, the provisions on self-consumptions in the Renewable Energy Directive are key and will influence the business case. I will go into those two provisions a bit more in detail in the next slides. So this slide is quite full. Sorry about this. I'll quickly guide you through it. You see on the lower left, in the current Renewables Directive, the GO regulation states that the guarantee of origin has to be issued in response to a request from a producer. However, member states may provide that no support is granted to a producer when that producer actually receives support payments for that guarantee of origin, for that renewables production. So member states are basically...
Sorry, Valde. I think the next... it's just a matter of conversion.
Okay.
So it's... I should remove the previous one. So you can resume here. Sorry.
Okay, perfect. Even just so not everyone has to be confused with too much text on this. Sorry, yes, exactly. So what happened basically is in the Renewables Directive as we have it now, there's no... hang on, but that's the self-consumption. Actually, let me go back and we'll take the guarantees of origin first, Fernando, if that's okay with you. So as said before, there is the current regulation, and member states are free to actually issue the guarantees of origin to renewables producers or not to do it when they support them. And then member states basically stated, well, how about overcompensation? Germany does not want to, for instance, issue the GOs, and currently member states have very conflicting practices, really. The Commission's proposal tries to address this and says that no guarantees of origin should be issued to producers receiving financial support, and those renewables producers receiving financial support, those guarantees of origin should be auctioned on a public platform, basically. However, this proposal sort of is really a problem because it does not solve the problem of overcompensation, and it does not solve the problem of GO oversupply that you have currently in the European markets. And the main problem here from a corporate renewables sourcing perspective is that you sort of cut the link between the production of a renewables plant and the consumption of that electricity if you're not allowed to directly procure or acquire those GOs from that renewables plant anymore in case that renewables plant receives subsidies. So basically, you know, all proponents of corporate PPAs basically argued against this proposal, and there's a draft report in the European Parliament that tried to address this issue, I think quite successfully, on the one hand, because it says those GOs should not be issued unless double compensation is avoided. So directly sort of addressing the concern of those that say, hey, if you get renewable support and on top get a payment for the guarantees of origin as a renewables producer, you might simply be overcompensated. And this is addressed in this provision. But again, in this proposal, you don't have the problem of GO oversupply solved. And still, there's sort of a lack of transparency for the final consumer to really know whether a corporate has been able to sign a corporate PPA based on public subsidies, which is usually paid for by the wider public, either taxpayers or the regular electricity consumer, or whether they actually have put additional money on the table to make that renewables investment feasible. So as a result of this debate, there's a few alternatives proposals being discussed currently, which include full disclosure and all sources that would really provide a complete picture of the electricity production and consumption within a country and across European countries. The counter-argument here is really that there's a lot of administrative burden related to this solution, but there are several member states like Austria that have already implemented this solution. And there's another proposal to implement an EU label for non-supported renewables plants, whereby the final consumer can really see sort of which corporate PPA would have sort of a stamp on it saying this corporate PPA was enabled by public subsidies or taking into account public subsidies, which is not a bad thing per se, but which has to be made transparent, or it has been signed without the use of public subsidies, basically, and therefore has had an even stronger and more positive effect on the energy transition, as is envisaged by the corporate PPAs. Now going to the, so that's basically the regulation on the guarantees of origin that will heavily impact how the corporate PPAs will be designed after 2020. But frankly speaking, I'm quite confident that this whole issue of maintaining the link between the renewables production and the actual consumption will be solved in the further legislative process, because that's the basic idea of the guarantees of origin anyway. So I'm pretty confident that this will be solved in a good way. Another very important regulation that will be influenced by the European legislation is the regulation on self-consumption. Right now, the Renewables Directive doesn't have an explicit provision on self-consumption, and currently the practice on self-consumption, which is really a key opportunity for corporate renewable sourcing, is very different across different member states. Some member states support self-consumption just for sort of households or small rooftop PV plants, and some for industry. Some support self-consumption for conventional technologies only, or for combined heat and power plants, or for renewable electricity production. And some member states basically support self-consumption through explicit payments or through exemptions from levies, fees, and taxes. And on the other hand, some member states actually do not support self-consumption at all, which is obviously hampering the business case for self-consumption in the context of corporate renewable sourcing. Now then, the main argument was, how about the benefits of self-consumption? Why shouldn't we support it throughout Europe? And that's why the Commission came up with a proposal with a provision in Article 21 of the Renewables Directive that member states shall really ensure that renewable self-consumers, first of all, are entitled to carry out self-consumption without being subject to disproportionate procedures and charges, which is really important, and to maintain their rights as consumers. And that they're not considered as energy suppliers, which would just pose an additional administrative barrier on them. Then the counter-argument was that does remove some of the barriers in some member states, but is that sufficient really? And that's why the European Parliament right now takes a position to say that self-consumption should be possible for everyone without being subject to any charge, fee, or tax, which would really fundamentally improve the business case for self-consumption. However, then the counter-argument was that self-consumption really has very different effects in each member state, and then in some member states, the full exemption of self-consumption from levies, fees, and taxes would really heavily redistribute the costs of renewables deployment from many users to just those very few users that in the end are not capable of using self-consumption. And so, as in the previous debate, there's currently alternative proposals being discussed, such as including into the law that barriers need to be proactively analyzed and removed, but that member states may be allowed to design exemptions from levies, fees, and taxes, but according to that context, and while at the same time avoiding disproportionate procedures and excessive charges. Actually, I see that I'm running out of time, so I'll hurry up for the remaining topics, and that will be much quicker. Apart from these market fundamentals that we're seeing and from these pending regulatory issues that will be solved in the next year or two, there's other pressing issues when we look at the corporate renewables sourcing market. Some of the key issues are really that we're still lacking knowledge dissemination. That includes the topics on the basic advantages of renewable sourcing. I think there's still quite a few potential consumers out there, or actually electricity consumers, but potential renewables consumers that don't know sufficiently about the advantages of corporate renewable sourcing in terms of fixing prices long term. Then there's a lack of knowledge in the field partially still on the availability of options. And there's the issue of sort of striking a good balance when presenting this and presenting the different options to different important players between the wide range of options, which can be very tailor-made, and to reduce the complexity of these options, because we believe really in the end it comes down to these three basic high-level options that we've seen, which is self-consumption, corporate PPAs, and geo-based products. And then, of course, I think what's really crucial as well, that increasingly, as this market is just starting right now in the European context, it's much more advanced in the US context, for instance, is really an exchange in detail of the preferences between producers and consumers. And that includes, for instance, that producers mainly seek revenue stabilization, of course, and the consumers mainly seek low prices, statistical clarity to make a clear claim, a secure electricity supply, and low transaction costs, among other things. But I think there needs to be really an intensified exchange between the different involved players to know more about each other's preferences. And then the next step, of course, is really the actual matchmaking. The market is not very liquid so far and is not super transparent, as it's by definition over-the-counter trade, but the matchmaking here is really key. And it's about matching the specific needs of consumers with the actual project pipeline that's out there on the renewables producer side, and the different market contexts that everybody is operating in. And the market is just starting now, so there's not really many platforms out there available to really do an efficient and effective matchmaking between producers and off-takers. So currently it really requires often still third parties to bring those two sides together to really find a perfect match between the preferences of the consumer and the available services on the producer side. And then, of course, another issue really is standardization, is a standardized approach that's necessary to identify options for specific consumer interests, and as well as standardizing PPA contracts, which right now can still be quite complex, but we're slowly moving towards standardization that will really support the market uptake for corporate PPAs. Now, what we suggest as ECOFIS as a general high-level approach is very straightforward, which is, of course, phase one, including the analysis, where you have to analyze your energy consumption and the future energy demand, where you have to analyze the potential for flexibility, as mentioned before, for instance, load management and demand-side response, and then analyze the potential for on-site or near-site self-generation and for other PPA options within those markets. Then, of course, in the second step, you need to develop a comprehensive strategy that is in line with your corporate social responsibility objectives, evaluate these different options that are out there that are usually still manifold, but then you simply have to prioritize them. And then one option is to really draft requests for proposals for green energy supply under specifically defined conditions. And then you enter, of course, in the execution phase, which includes marketing the RFPs, doing the matchmaking, and then actually entering into the contractual and the price negotiations as a high-level approach to structure this. So concluding this presentation is we see current trends which start looking at PPAs right now if you haven't done so. There is really increasing renewable sourcing activities going on in the market, and the market fundamentals really show that there's an improving case for corporate renewable sourcing as there's this decreasing renewables cost, increasing wholesale market prices expected, and the cost pressure and renewable support schemes, which always make a case for corporate renewables, renewable PPAs. Then there's the regulatory framework for the period after 2020, which is not perfectly clear yet, but is heavily impacting the corporate renewable sourcing market. There's the provision on removing the barriers, which is very good. There's the provision on guarantees of origin, which still has to be and is very likely to be improved. And there's the provisions on self-consumption, where I'm pretty sure that ultimately there will be sort of a balanced solution where self-consumption is supported, but in a balanced manner that really is according to the member state context. And we at ECOFIS really believe it's important to implement renewable sourcing solutions that are obviously cost-effective, that's a starting point, that are feasible and not too complex, that's very important as well, robust against external scrutiny regarding the quality criteria that are introduced initially in the beginning, and of course that everybody involved in this is well informed on the potentially changing regulatory environments, looking for solutions that are really robust against those potentially changing regulatory environments. And with this, sorry for taking up so much time, I'll conclude my presentation.